Introduction to the book of Romans. We're on page number 5. So we got some background. I've highlighted some things in my notebook. The date of the founding is traditionally given to be about 753 BC. Rome had become, by this time, literally the greatest city in the world. It was the capital of the Roman Empire. In Rome, the Roman Empire was what we would call the then known world, staying away from the Far East, China and all that. But the Romans were a world military and political power. Rome, one of the reasons why this book is so key, is that it represents the Gentile nations as the capital of the Gentile world. So Paul is writing to a city that is teeming with people from all around the world. There were many Jews in Rome. Remember, Christ was crucified almost 30 years before. Jews had been, over the years, a lot of anti-Semitism. They had been forced or pressured out of Jerusalem, out of Israel. And so there were Jews really scattered all over the then known world. And there were plenty of them by this time, by 30 years after the crucifixion of Christ, in Rome. In fact, if you go to the book of Acts, Acts chapter number 2, you'll see there that there's a list of 17 different countries or people groups that were Jewish that were there at the day of Pentecost to hear what was taking place and to see what was taking place when Peter preached and the cloven tongues like as of fire fell and all of that. There were Jews from 17 different countries there who obviously, it was Pentecost. Remember what Pentecost is. Pentecost is not a New Testament feast. It's an Old Testament feast. It's one of the Old Testament 7 Jewish feasts in the Old Testament. Well, Jewish men had to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year, and they were there from 17 different countries. And when this was over, they scattered back to wherever they came from. So that's a great evangelism plan, to be perfectly honest with you. So the gospel was taken all over the world just from Acts chapter 2, from the results of what we call today the Pentecost. About the author, Paul the Apostle. From chapter, actually Paul the Apostle is mentioned for the first time in the Bible at the end of the book of Acts chapter 7, the 7th chapter of the book of Acts. He shows up. He begins to take a significant role in chapter number 8, and he takes the primary role in the book of Acts in chapter number 13. Peter, up through the first 12 chapters, is pretty much the predominant figure, the leader, I suppose, of the church. I think we could say that and be safe about it. But by the time we get to chapter number 13, we find the church at Antioch is mentioned. That's hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. And Paul and Barnabas are sent out from Antioch of Syria. They're sent out to the world at that time on their first missionary journey, which was the first of 3 that constitutes the next 8 or 9 chapters of the book of Acts. Those are the main subjects of those chapters of Acts 13 right up into about chapter number 21. So Paul becomes the key figure, and then from 21, 22 to the end of the book, Paul continues to be the key figure. Remember, he was arrested. He made his appeal to Caesar. And so the rest of the book of Acts is Paul going to Rome, chapters 22 and 23 and 24, et cetera, and all of the things that happened on his voyage or his trek to Rome, and then what happened when he got to Rome in chapter 28 of the book of Acts. So that's kind of how, in all that time, by the way, Paul has not, to our knowledge, Paul has not gone to Rome at any of those times until later on, until the end of the book, of Acts does he go to Rome. And that's important because we know that the Roman Catholic Church teaches dogmatically teaches that Peter was the first pope. The pope is the papa. He is the head. He is the vicar of Christ, is what he is called by the church. He is the representative of Christ on earth, the pope. Not Billy Graham, not George Grace or Kevin Pesky, but the pope is the representative of Christ according to the Catholic Church. Well, the Catholic Church says that he was in Rome. The problem is the Bible never says anything about that. In fact, we have good reason to believe, here on page number 5, we have good reason to believe that he wasn't at Rome, at least up into the time of the book of Romans was written. Look at the second last paragraph on page 5. The Roman Catholic Church believes Peter founded the church at Rome and was the first pope. I don't believe this for several reasons. First, in the salutation in the last chapter, that is when he's saying goodbye in chapter 16, Paul salutes 27 men. I'm quoting Alva McLean, and there's another guy who says 26 men, so it looks like a contradiction. I'm only quoting 2 people that contradicted them. I think it's 26, but Alva McLean's smarter than me, and he said it's 27. But anyway, he salutes 27 men by name. It would have been astounding if Peter had been there and Paul not saluted him. He knew Peter. You can go back earlier in the book of Acts. They knew each other extremely well. Go back to Acts chapter 15 when they had that great council of Jerusalem. They were both there to settle salvation by grace through faith. But Peter is not mentioned in the epistle to the Romans. Secondly, Paul stated in Romans 15 that it is the aim of his life to preach the gospel where it has not been preached. He doesn't want to build on the foundation of another man. Now that's a little weaker of an argument in my mind, but it is an argument that has some weight. Quoting the text, quote, "Lest I should build on any man's foundation." But we know he wanted to go to Rome, and he did eventually go to Rome at the end of the book of Acts. If the Apostle Peter had been there, the Apostle Paul, I would think, would not have turned his eyes in that direction. He wouldn't have gone there. Why? He didn't go there because he was just taking a tour and he was on vacation. He went there because he wanted to have an effect and influence on the Christians that were there. He wanted to bring the gospel to them. And of course, many of them were saved already, but Paul the Apostle showing up at your church next Sunday morning, that'll get some attention. It would get some attention here, I know that. But just thinking back in those days, Paul, this is 25 years after his conversion. Paul is coming to Rome. Paul is the guy that was commissioned to go in Acts chapter 13 on that first missionary journey, and he traveled around much of the Roman Empire. I'm sure many people in 25 years heard of the Apostle Paul, and now he's actually coming to our city. We're going to meet this person. Now, we think of air travel. I could be in Rome tomorrow afternoon, or maybe before if I could catch the right flights. You couldn't be in Rome from Rochester at this time in a long time, maybe forever. You couldn't get there. They didn't cross the Atlantic Ocean, I don't think, in ships back in those days. So you got to kind of look and have a historical perspective on all of this too. The limitations that they had in travel, and yet the word was dispersed around the world. In fact, Paul writes to them that their reputation, their faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. So in 30 years, the gospel has gone to Rome, it's gone around the world, and it's come back to Paul that these people are great Christian people, and they're spreading the gospel around the world. So there's a third reason at the bottom. Luke was a very careful historian. He was a medical doctor, but he was a historian. He's the one that wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. But he did not record in the book of Acts Peter as the founder of the Church of Rome. If a man as prominent as Peter had founded this church, you would think that Luke would have mentioned that in some way along the way. When Paul wrote the epistle, page number 6, he had not yet been to Rome, 1:15, but often wished to go there, 2 passages, and now purposed to do so, and he does eventually. It seems most likely that Paul wrote this epistle from Corinth on his 3rd missionary journey. That would put us down somewhere in the neighborhood of Acts chapter 22, and he dictated the letter to a secretary named Tertius, and his name shows up at the end of the book. If you go to chapter number 16, to the end of the book, you'll see, let's see, well, it isn't Tertius. Where is Tertius there? Written to the Romans from Corinthus and sent by Phoebe. Where is Tertius? Anybody?
22.
Where is it? In verse 22? Oh yeah, I Tertius. He's writing it up in verse 22. I Tertius, who wrote this epistle. So he was the secretary for the Apostle Paul. Next paragraph says it's clear that the congregation at Rome was a thorough mixture of Jews and Gentiles. That's another good reason for Paul to go there, because he has got a world audience. He's not just preaching to Jews. He's not just preaching to Gentiles. There were so many Jews that had been scattered throughout the world. Now he's got a very broad based audience when he gets there. Lots of people, lots of different countries, the capital of the world at that time, essentially. Now, at the end of the book, you notice I say 26 persons are greeted by my count. You can count them. Maybe you'll get 25 or 28. I don't know. But I get 26. And 2/3 of the names are Greek, which would mean that they were Gentile individual, quite likely. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, chapter 15 in this book. While it might be said that Jesus was the minister to the circumcision, the Jews, and we see 15:8 quoted, now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister to the circumcision, that is the Jew, those who were circumcised, for the truth of God to confirm the promises made unto the fathers. Now when I say or have written that he was the minister to the circumcision or to the Jews, we know Jesus is for the whole world. But we know that Jesus came first as a Jewish Messiah. So if you're questioning why I wrote that, I want you to understand he came first. He came unto his own, John said. And his own, the Jews, received him not. But as many as received him, Jews and Gentiles, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them to believe on his name. Remember in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is commissioning his disciples to go and preach 2 by 2, he told them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that was his primary focus in the Gospel of Matthew, was the Jewish people and at his first coming. That doesn't mean that he never talked to a Gentile. We know he talked to a Samaritan woman. There's plenty of illustrations to a Phoenician woman, etc. So there's plenty of illustrations in the gospel where he intersected with Gentiles. But his primary ministry was to the Jew as the Jewish Messiah. Even in the book of Acts, the beginning of the book of Acts in chapter 2, you can see that Peter is preaching to the Jews. That's what Acts chapter 2 and Pentecost was all about. Pentecost was a Jewish feast. Pentecost was held in Jerusalem, the capital of the Jew. And Paul was preaching to Jews from 17 different countries. That's Acts chapter 2. In fact, in Acts chapter 3, it continues. Peter is again preaching to the Jews. As time went on, remember, Peter had a dream. He had a vision. Do you remember the vision in Acts chapter 10 that he had? Where the sheets came down with all manner of animals, and the angel of the Lord said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And he said, "I can't do that. I'm a Sabbatarian, law-abiding Jew. I don't eat pork. I don't eat mussels. I don't eat shrimp cocktail. I don't eat that stuff." And of course, the lesson in that was there's nothing unclean of itself. And that whole thing was in the chapter, the same chapter, where Cornelius, a Gentile of the Italian band, That's where he trusted Christ as Savior. So what is happening, by the time we get to Acts chapter 10, we see that the gospel now is opening up, going to the Jew and to the Gentile. And by the time we get to Acts chapter 13, we see Paul the Apostle and Barnabas sent all throughout the Roman Empire to preach the gospel. But initially, they were aiming at salvation as of the Jews. That's what was that the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4? She knew that salvation, that the gospel, that the Messiah was primarily a Jewish Messiah. She acknowledged that there. But by the time we get into the book of Acts, the gospel is going into the world. That's what Acts chapter 28 was all about, to go into all the world and preach the gospel. Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, John chapter 20, Acts chapter 1 and 2. About the book of Romans, look with me in the middle of page number 6. It's the most formal of all Paul's letters. He wrote Romans to reveal God's sovereign plan of salvation. The first 8 chapters deal with the sin problem. It's the biggest problem that men have. Some of you know Tim Lee. Tim Lee lost his legs in Vietnam. A horrible thing. A horrible thing to have to live with. I was in a service this afternoon. A man gave a testimony when he was a child. He lost both of his arms. He touched high-tension wires. He became the conductor of high-tension wires. It destroyed both of his arms to the degree that they amputated him. Horrible. He doesn't have any arms. No legs. No arms. But I'll tell you what's worse than that. Having no hope. Without Christ in this world. You have to put that in perspective. I'm not making fun or light of losing your legs or your arms. But worse than that is losing your own soul. That's what Jesus said. So the first 8 chapters of the book are dealing with sin. We got to get out of this. This is your biggest problem, is your sin problem. It's the biggest problem we've got. It's not global cooling, warming, neutral, whatever it is. I'm not sure. It's not the biggest problem. It's not the government, although it is a big problem. There's lots of big problems. There's lots of big problems. But the biggest problem that man has is sin. And by the way, all those other things really kind of flow out of that, don't they? The things that we deal with, that we're trying to legislate against, so many of them are just the violations of God's moral law. And the man seems to give in more and more to the devil's side of things. So anyway, Paul wrote Romans to reveal God's plan of salvation, to show how Jews and Gentiles fit into the plan. That's 9, 10, and 11. Now that Jesus came, he came to the Jews. They rejected him. He's done with the Jews. He's moving on. No. No, he is moving on, but he's not done with Israel. I am theologically, and the church has been since its beginnings, premillennial in its theology when we're talking about future things, eschatology. We believe that Christ is going to come and literally rule and reign for 1,000 years on this earth. That's what we teach. And that Israel is still part of God's plan for the tribulation and for that 1,000-year reign of Christ. That the Jew still will have a very prominent, when I say the Jew, they're going to have to be converted Jews. They're going to have to be Jews that come to faith in Christ. Ultimately, I believe that's what the tribulation is really all about. That's what Revelation is all about. But I believe that God is not done with Israel. Blindness in part, Romans 11 says, but God's not done with Israel. That's chapters 9, 10, and 11. In the middle of those chapters is the doctrine of election. And boy, do we get in trouble. We get in trouble because all of a sudden God is picking and choosing winners in chapters 9, 10, and 11. Picking and choosing those who will be saved and those who will not be saved. And that's where covenant theology comes in. The doctrine of election, that God has elected or chosen certain people to be saved and not. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because we're going to spend a lot of time there later on when we get to those 3 chapters. In fact, in your notebook, if you want to read ahead, you get into chapters 9, 10, and 11. There's a lot of stuff that I've written about that and tried to be succinct, concise about it, to clarify what I believe the issues are, the right side and the wrong side of those issues in chapters 9, 10, and 11. Then by the time we get to chapter number 12, look at chapter 12, verse 1. This is the first sermon that I ever heard or the first Bible study. It wasn't a sermon. First Bible study that I ever heard at First Bible Baptist Church was on this passage of Scripture. Pastor Wayne P. Mullen. I talked to him this week, by the way, Nancy. I talk to him about every other week. I talked to Pastor Mullen, and Pastor Mullen was leading a Bible study. And the Bible study was Friday night. It was probably September the 2nd, 3rd, 1972, somewhere around there. I got saved August 29th, which was a Tuesday. So August 30th was a Wednesday. Is there 31 days? So it was September 1st, Friday night, is the first time I came to church here in 1972. And I sat down, and Pastor Mullen knew there were 2 good-looking Italian couple there. Remember that? That was me and my wife, except I wasn't Italian. I just looked Italian. I always wanted to be Italian. But anyway, I want to be. And we were sitting there, and he started in on Romans 12. I'll never forget it. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That's the first thing I heard from the Bible from this church. And Pastor Mullen could preach the gospel from any passage in the Bible, couldn't he? He could get there. I don't care if it was Genesis 1:1, Revelation 22:16, and everything in between. He could start anywhere, and he would be talking about Jesus and what it meant to be saved. So my wife wasn't saved. She made a profession of faith that night, and probably within a week or 2 after that, she really got a hold of it. But I think she uses September 1st as her date of salvation because she made a profession then. Just a second. Remember, we're on video. What's that?
I just wanted to ask a question.
Okay, we'll have time at the end for questions, okay? Just because we're not filming because we don't have Kodak anymore. We're digitizing right now, or whatever happens when you do it this way, okay? But we will have questions when we're done here very shortly. So the last part of the book is practical Christian living. How can I live not in this world and not be part of, how can I be in the world but not of the world is the way it goes. How can I live in this world but not be so saturated by its philosophies, its dogmatics, its ideologies, that I get sucked into it and start thinking with the same kind of worldview that the world has? How can I avoid that? And so what we read in chapters 12 and 13, right up to the end of the book, is what Paul has to say about practical Christian living. So that's the general outline of the book. And you can see down there at the bottom of page number 6, the themes, keywords, and divisions, chapters 1 through 8, doctrine, the sin problem. And not that the rest isn't doctrine, but it's really focusing on the doctrines of salvation. And then chapters 9 through 11, national, the Jew problem. What about Israel? Is God done with them? And then the life problem. How do I live now that I'm a Christian? On page number 7, there's a list of quotations there from mostly prominent people. You may not know Ray Stedman. He's the last one on the list, but I've read several of his books. I enjoy reading him. He's a pretty solid Bible teacher. And that's what he was. He was a pastor and teacher in California. He went home to be with the Lord some time ago, but I enjoy. And he said, if Romans is the most intense and penetrating in its insight into the understanding of truth, it is safe to say that Romans is probably the most powerful human document ever written. There are many that agree with that assessment. Now on page 17 of Hoyt's compilation, Dr. McLean, that I reference oftentimes throughout my notes, Dr. McLean, I believe, is the founder of Grace Theological Seminary in Winona Lake, Wisconsin or Minnesota, somewhere in there. But that's who he is. If you're wondering, who's this McLean guy? But he wrote a good premillennial perspective on the book of Romans commentary, and I quote him often in my notes. But he said, the importance of the book of Romans is that it is an inspired interpretation of the Christian faith. It presents the most comprehensive and outstanding interpretation of the facts of the Gospels and Acts. In other words, the first 5 books of the New Testament. So think about the organization. Matthew, transitional, takes us from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's very Jewish because it's very messianic, the Gospel of Matthew. That doesn't mean there's nothing in there for you. It's just transitioning from a Jewish economy, Old Testament, law, into the New Testament of grace. That's Matthew. Mark and Luke offer much of what's found in Matthew, but there's some things in Mark that aren't in any of the other Gospels. Same thing with Luke. Then the Gospel of John takes a turn. The Gospel of John really introduces us to the divinity of Christ, who he was, that he is truly God manifest in the flesh. And that's where we read in chapter 1 that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and all that stuff. And then it says in verse 14, and the Word, who is God, was made flesh and dwelt among us. That's John 1:14. So now we're introduced to the divinity of Christ. He's the Son of God, God manifest in the flesh. So now we've got a picture, transition. We learn about his life in Mark and Luke and specific things. John picks up on the theme of his divinity, that he is the second person of the Trinity, God manifest in the flesh. And then he is crucified. He resurrects, the end of all those Gospels, and that takes us into the book of Acts. The ascension is in chapter number 1, and Pentecost is in chapter number 2, and then we get rolling. To the Jew first, Acts chapter 2 and 3. By the time we get to Acts chapter 10, it's going to the Gentile. Cornelius gets saved. The Ethiopian eunuch, Acts chapter 8, etc. By the time you're in Acts chapter 13, we're off on Paul's missionary journeys around the Roman Empire at that time. So that shows you the order of the books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. It's not incidental or accidental. It's obvious that it has been done purposely. We've got the general outline on page number 7. We have the exploded outline, which again, I can't tell you how important that is to get to that and just read it through to solidify things. And that takes us to page number 15, where we really begin to get into the phrase by phrase, verse by verse, word by word, descriptions, definitions, clarifications of the different things that are said in the book. Now, I think there's about, if I'm not mistaken, 270 or so pages in the notebook, somewhere in that. And from this point on, basically what we're doing is we're taking sentences, we're taking chapters apart, paragraphs apart, down into sentences, and then phrases in sentences, and sometimes words in those sentences. So we're trying to break it down so we get a pretty good idea. Is this the best that anybody could do? No. It's what I did, okay? I'm not comparing this to anybody else's work. I'm not saying you really need to get my notebook, but I will say this. This notebook is written for this level of a course. If you went to a graduate school or cemetery or seminary someplace and you got into the book of Romans in a graduate level, you're going to go much further. I'm not going into original languages. I'm not talking about the Greek word and all that. I'm not opposed to people doing that. But I'm not a Greek scholar. Did I take Greek? I confess I did. I confess I did. But it didn't help me. I took it a long time ago, and I knew so little about it even then. Now I know even littler about it. But some people knock the original languages. Remember this: The Bible was written in the original languages. It was written in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. That's what it was written in initially. So there was good reason for God to choose those languages to inspire His Word in. So we need to be careful. Now, what bothers me is when somebody takes an original language word and then they begin to correct the English. Now, there's reasons why people do that. Possibly that the text that they're reading from doesn't have the same Greek word that the King James translators use to translate the word that's in the King James Bible. It's a different word, so there's a different translation. A different word was the word that they chose. That could be the reason for it. It could be that there's no word in that Greek text, and the King James translators had that verse or that phrase in theirs, and so there's a difference between them, but it's because one had and one had not. So there's lots of reasons for that. And by the way, language is fluid, isn't it? This is an old illustration. Old as I am. Jesus was high on a mountain. Now, if you say that to a 10 or 15-year-old kid that's never been to church, what does he think? You see? Because the word is ambiguous. That's all I'm saying. For those of us that have read the Bible, studied the Bible, you don't have a problem with that. But I'm just simply saying that language in itself is somewhat ambiguous. Oftentimes, context dictates the meaning of the word. Let me give you another one, and I believe this is true, and I'm not undercutting anything. I'm just trying to help you understand. I'm a KJV guy. Anybody been around here for 47 years with me? A couple of you have. You know that. The word logos, it's a Greek word. It means word. It's translated 24 different ways in the King James Bible. It's logos word. No, it's not always word. Sometimes it's preach. And 22 other words. When the King James translators looked at that, they determined by reading the context the best meaning for the word that they put in the text. That's why I say language is fluid. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with what I'm reading. I'm just simply saying language is fluid, and we need to be careful when we start picking people apart because, oh, you think the Greek is better, not? And some people do. I don't think the Greek is better, but I do believe it was the language in the New Testament that was used to inspire the Word of God. So I'm going to give it credit where credit is due. But that doesn't mean I can't understand my Bible because I don't understand Greek. The people that translated this, they understood Greek. And they put words down that fit the context, and with their educational background, they believed that this was the best word, and that's good enough for me. It's good enough for me. I believe the King James Bible is a preserved Word of God for me in the English language. I make no apology for that. I don't make excuses for that. I don't correct it. I have a difficult time living by it. So I want you to understand where I am, and that's on digitized, so everybody knows that, okay? So, but I don't go into languages here. I think the English language is very sufficient to understand everything in the Bible. Why wouldn't it be? Introduction to the book of Romans, again, you can see here we talk about the service of Jesus Christ. Let's just kind of zip through. I'm going to take 5 more minutes. We'll dig a little bit. We've read the whole chapter, but let's see what we can pick out of these first few phrases and verses. Paul is a servant. He's a servant of Christ. This was Paul's favorite term that he used with reference to himself. In fact, you can see in several other books of the Bible, he called himself a servant. In fact, other authors in the New Testament did the same thing. They saw themselves as servants, not as bosses or popes or archbishops. They saw themselves as servants. Minister means help, serve. That's what a minister is. Ministers are here to help and serve people. They're not here to boss people around. Now, they're here to lead Oftentimes, leadership is part of the responsibility of the pastor, the elder, the deacon, or whatnot. But primarily, we are servants. In fact, we are all servants. Not just the pastor, not just the evangelist, not just the elder or the deacon. We're all servants. So when Paul says he's a servant, it's not like this is a special title that was given to him. We all are to be servants. In fact, Mel Sabaka, years ago, dear old saint that preached here many times in the earlier days of the church, he said, we're saved to serve, saved to serve, saved to serve. There's a lesson. In fact, I preached it, and I preached it here before this afternoon at another church that I preached at. I said in Deuteronomy chapter 10, the question is asked, what does the Lord require of you? And there's 5 things in there. To fear the Lord, to walk in all of His ways, to love Him, to serve Him, and to keep His commandments. In that order. It's kind of a sequence or a progression. You must first believe what God says, that He says what He means and means what He says. That's where salvation comes. I believe the Bible. I believe what God said about Himself, about me, and I'm going to do it. And then I begin to walk in all of His ways. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. And then I fall in love with Him. One day I will realize I'm in love with God. I don't think it starts that way. I wasn't in love with God the day I got saved. I was just glad I got saved. I didn't really even know how to love God. I didn't know God. I hadn't read the Bible from cover to cover ever. I read little snippets and portions and a few things I learned from going to church and listening to other people. I didn't know very much. I can't say I was in love with God the day I got saved, but I believed Him. I believed what was written there. And then we fall in love, and then we serve. We serve out of love. We don't serve out of fear. I don't serve because if I don't, I'll get 4 flat tires. If I don't do it, if I don't put money in the offering plate, God's going to blow up my camshaft in my car. I don't think God deals with us that way. I think He might blow up your camshaft for nothing. No, just kidding. No, I don't serve out of fear. I believe that He says what He means and means what He says, but I'm not going, boy, I better do it. I'm obliged to do this or something's going to happen to me. I serve out of love. I don't give my wife gifts and presents because I'm afraid of her. If I don't, what will she do to me? I do because I love her. I want to show affection to her, appreciation to her. Isn't that why we give people gifts? Isn't that why we serve people? For that reason? That's the right reason. Serve. Saved to serve. Notice in the verses there, that's what Jesus was at the bottom of page number 15. He came as a servant. Verse number 44 of Mark 10, and whosoever of you will be of the chiefest shall be the servant of all. For the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister and to give His life a ransom for many. That's verse 45, the one that isn't in your notes. That's the next verse. So, we see other salutations, as we mentioned, other authors, James, Peter, Jude, John, and Revelation, that call themselves servants. Paul said he was called to be an apostle. The word means sent one. Now, everyone is an apostle of sorts. We're all sent to preach the gospel. But there is a specific group of people in the Bible that were called the apostles. They were the chosen apostles of Christ. Now you've got the original 12, but you'll find that Paul and Barnabas were also called apostles in other texts. But it's the apostles that were specifically called by Christ personally, individually, is a very short list of 14 or so individuals. Separated unto the gospel of God. That means this is what life is all about. I'm separated unto my wife. This is a good illustration. In January, on the 27th of January, 1968, my wife and I went down the aisle at St. Mary's Church in Central Valley, New York, and I separated myself unto her. I made a vow to her to be faithful to her, to love her, to care for her, all the stuff that goes in that, all the mushy stuff. And she to me. What we did is we separated ourselves. I separated myself from all of the other women in the world and said, this is mine. This is the one that I will serve. This is the most important person to me. From this day forward, I've made that decision. I'm separating. Separating unto the gospel simply means same thing. Everything else in my life is relatively insignificant and meaningless. It's the gospel. Woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel of Christ, Paul said. He was separated to the gospel, much like a man or a woman is separated to his or her spouse as you stand in your wedding day with one another. Does that make sense? Make sense to you? That's what separation is, true separation, which he had promised afore. We've given you several verses there. This is spoken of. Christ was prophesied in the Old Testament. It wasn't, you had to read. You had to study. You had to believe what you were reading to get this, to see the Messiah in the Old Testament. You couldn't, through casual reading, just read Isaiah 53 and say, oh, that's Jesus, 300 years before Christ was born. You had to be a student of God's Word and believe it. But many of the prophets spoke of the promise of the coming of Christ. That's verse number 2. In verse 3, we see the dual nature. That means that Christ was both man and God. There isn't anybody else like that. He is a unique individual in all of the universe. You realize that Jesus is still a man? You realize that? He didn't lose that. He is the God-man. Still, God became a man, and he remains that way for all of eternity. He didn't get resurrected and say, well, let's get rid of this filthy human body now. There, I'm back just the Son of God, and I haven't got all this corruption all over me, this fleshy. He is the Son of God, and he has a dual nature. He is all God, and he is all man. There's only one person like that in all of the universe, the dual nature of Christ. Over there in verse number 4, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness. Of course, we're talking about what took place. The greatest event in the history of mankind is the resurrection of Christ. It's not the birth of Christ. It's not the crucifixion of Christ. Because both of those could have happened, and he could have never come out of that grave, and we would be, of all people, Paul said in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, we would be most miserable. It's the resurrection of Christ that is the most important event that has ever happened. So the God-man came out of the grave alive under his own power. Power, we think of power when we think of, oh, I can bench press 250, or we think of power in that sense. But power, the word power means authority. He has the power, he has the authority to be the Son of God. He is the Son of God, truly the Son of God, not because just somebody made that up, it was somebody's opinion, but it's his very essence and nature, his authority as the Son of God. The grace at the bottom of 17, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. What a beautiful word that is, grace. Grace. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom we have received grace and apostleship, by whom we have received grace. Grace, the grace of God. I heard somebody say recently, I did this and I did that and I did that and I did all these things for God. And then he said, and also the grace of God got me through. And I thought, wait a second. That's like saying I'm saved because of the grace of God and I've done a good job myself. This was a Christian saying that. I think they got their theology a little bit. I didn't say anything to the person, but anyway, I think they were a little mixed up in what they were saying. Anyway, let's go to the top of page 18, apostleship. The apostle is the sent one. We see Acts 1, ye shall be witnesses unto me, Jesus. Philippians chapter 2, he's given a name above every name, Jesus. It's about Jesus. The world doesn't like the name Jesus. You can say God. You can pray to God in your prayer at the confirmation of the Supreme Court justice, and you can say, "Dear God, we're invoking you." You can say that, but don't say, "Dear Jesus." Naughty, naughty, naughty. They don't like Jesus. God, see, because that kind of includes Allah, Vishnu. They're all gods too. But when you say Jesus, you just narrow the field down to one. There's only one that's named Jesus. Jesus. Number 4 is the calling, and this is a great place to stop and take questions right now, all right? Mark this, because this is where we will pick ourselves up on page number 18. We got through our introduction. We got through all of the administrative material that we need, and I want to encourage you to read through your notes. I won't repeat what I said at the beginning of the class, but there's plenty of help in here for you to understand very clearly what this book is all about. So let's see if we can entertain some questions right now about anything. Could be about this, or it could be about the administrative issues. And Elise, you asked me a couple questions, and they were good. Why don't you can you remember what they were? Ask those again, because I think we ought to say them to everybody, answer them to everybody. Okay? The first question was?
On memorizing the scripture.
Memorizing the scriptures. You see that? I'm not going to ask you to write that out every week, but we may come in here, and at the outset of the class, those of you who are our credit students, I may say, we're going to take the first 2 minutes tonight to write down our memory verses. Everybody go. And the credit students have to write them down. The rest of you can write them down if you memorize them, or take a guess at them, or do your grocery list. That's what you can do, whatever you want to do. But those of you that are credit students, I may ask you, right at the outset of class, I want you to write down on a piece of paper what our memory verse is from chapter 2, chapter 1, whatever, okay? Second question?
On the syllabus, it says summarize the main truths of each chapter in 100 words.
In the syllabus, I make mention of summarizing, giving a 100-word summary, and I will do that from time to time. I won't ask you to do that on every chapter, but I may, next week, we're going to go home, we're going to do chapter number 2. I want you to read it carefully, and then what I want you to do is I want you to write out just a brief 100-word summary on what the gut of chapter number 2 is all about. I want you to submit that to me, but I will tell you that. So if you don't hear that from me, you're not required to do that, okay? So those were Elise's 2 questions. Yes, sir?
Did I just hear that from you? Or is that hypothetical?
Which thing?
The chapter 2.
No. That was hypothetical. I'm sorry. No, that's hypothetical. He's a smart kid. He really is. I don't know if I can handle him in my class. I don't know that if I can teach him anything, to be honest with you. He's a good student.
Why don't you switch places?
He's funny. Maybe we will. Maybe by the end of this semester we will.
He says no. He's shaking his head.
He is. He's a fine young man. I love him. I do. Somebody else, a question.
I had one
Yes, ma'am.
way back when you were talking about Christ coming on earth and being here for 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
I've never read that anywhere. And I've been through the Bible so many years.
Okay. The question is, what about the millennial reign of Christ? Okay, what is that? What are we talking about? The 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, the 1,000 years comes from Revelation chapter number 20, the first 7 verses. I believe it's 6 different times there's 1,000 years reference there to a kingdom that will be set up on earth. And what you have to do is you have to go back to chapter 19, chapter 18, and follow the sequence of events. Chapter 19 records the second coming of Christ. Chapter 20 records then the millennial reign of Christ at his second coming. So it doesn't say those words. You have to read both chapter 19 and chapter 20 and put that together in a historical timeline in those 2 chapters. Now, there are many other references in the Bible to a millennial reign. There are whole chapters in the book of Psalms that do. And I know I've given out notes in other classes. Right now, I've been doing this since 6 o'clock this morning, and I'm running out of intellectual energy, so I don't have that anyplace else right now in mind. But those two you'll get it out of there. You read chapter 19 and 20 of the book of Revelation.
I've read Revelation, but
Okay. But with that in mind now, read those two chapters and you'll see how they fit together.
yeah.
Okay?